So soils are really, really important. Half of the equation when you're trying to grow something in your yard, half of the equation is what you see above ground. The other half of the equation is what's happening below ground. And of course, water is a big part of that as well. And I'll show you some slides. We'll talk about how that water and soil relationship plays into this for your success. It is the most important part of your landscaping garden. It is the structure, it is the reservoir for water, it is the nutrient reservoir as well. But what a lot of people don't understand, we're not going to get into real depth of soil chemistry here, because there's whole courses on the chemistry of soils and all that kind of stuff. We're not going to get into that. We're just going to try to cover the basics to help you as a homeowner, as a gardener, understand how you can be a little more successful. Most Utah soils have relatively low organic matter, just our native soils here. And we were talking earlier here in the office, if you could get an aerial view, kind of a geologic aerial view of our area and understand historically what happened here, there was the old Lake Bonneville. So much of the valley locations are old lake bottom. Now, if you understand soil properties a little, old lake bottom, it's sediment, it's silts and clay, and depending on where you are in that bottom and where the stream flows were in, then you find deltas and you find these deposits of rock and sand and coarser material. But then in lower lying areas, you find those heavy deposits of silts and clays. So depending on where you live, depending on what's going on, depending on how much movement of soil has happened, that's what makes the difference of, some people will say, oh, I have complete sand, and others have complete clay in a relatively short distance, because it's all old lake bottom here. We don't also live in a climate that's constantly rejuvenating lots and lots of plant matter, organic matter that's being put back into that soil. So soils build quite slow in a desert, and they build, and we're a desert and an old lake bottom. So the pH, the acidity or alkalinity of the soil, average is also quite high. It's about 8, which is 10 times more alkaline than the neutral soil of 7, which is pH, or excuse me, a pH of 7, which is neutral. And so you'll hear people talk about alkalinity or acidity. We're generally alkaline. Now, you can change soil pH a little bit with what's added to it. The nutrients and organic material does change the pH of a soil. It can kind of neutralize it a little bit more, but it is what it is here with our average of pH with higher salts and different things, which make it typically a little more basic than acidic. The lower the scale on pH and more acidic, the higher the scale is more basic. Many Utah soils have a terrible structure due to that lack of organic matter. And then there's heavy clay and subsoil particles all mixed through. So it's good to understand some of these basics. Now let's kind of put this in perspective of texture and soil structure, just to help you understand, these are things that you're really not looking at with your eye. When you pick up dirt and you say, oh, it's soil, when we talk sand, silt, and clay, we're talking about actual particle, these physical particle sizes. So look at here a comparison. Sand to 2 millimeter or microns or whatever they are, silt 0.05, and clay less than 0.002. As a comparison, just on a scale, that's the size. If you had one sand particle, one silt particle, one clay particle, here it is. And that's the difference. So as you put these things together, they form what's referred to as a texture. It's the percent of sand, silt, and clay particles in a soil together, and it's a percentage by weight that gives you a soil texture. So some people would say the texture of my soil is sandy, which means they probably have a higher portion, a higher percentage of sand, but there's still some silt and there's still some clay in that soil. But the highest percentage, of course, is sand. And then vice versa. You might say the texture of my soil is clay-like. It's a clay soil. You have a higher percentage of clay molecules, particles in your soil. So you can get classifications where you say you can have a mix of these, a nice balance of these, and organic matter then becomes loam. Now, funny enough, see my little thing on the side, gravel, sand, silt, and clay. those are the structures of these inorganic particles. And then when you add loam in certain percentages, or excuse me, you add organic matter in certain percentages, now you create a loamy soil. So we'll get into a little bit more of that. That's what composting is going to do, is create loamier soils. So the influence of water holding and the water holding capacity, meaning that ability for air movement and drainage and tilt, and we'll talk about tilt in a second, compaction, nutrient retention, all of those things are very important for water holding. You know, how much of the percentage of each of these and the all this stuff, and we're going to get into a little bit more depth. Large amounts of organic matter are going to improve any of the physical characteristics of soil, whether you have too much clay, too much silt, or too much sand. So that's going to be important because that's, again, tying into compost. So let's talk real quick about pH again. It's again the indication of acidity or alkalinity. 7 is neutral, while the values below 7 are acidic, above them are basic. You don't necessarily want acidic soil, although some plants prefer more acidic soils and some plants prefer more basic soils. So if you're trying to grow blueberries in our climate with a basic soil, you're not going to succeed because those plants prefer a more acidic soil base. So you can grow them here if you really take measures to do different things to acidify the soil. They sell special soil acidifiers, and usually you have to grow those in a pot. So just understanding the soil helps you also understand what's going to be successful. If you try to grow some certain plants, you know, from the Pacific Northwest, they grow naturally in acidic soils, but then they ship them here in a container and we plant them in our yards and they struggle. Well, sometimes there's nothing you can do about that because they prefer a more acidic soil, and changing the pH of the soil is actually quite difficult. Organic matter helps, but it's really hard to change that pH level. Many plants do have a range though, so they'll fit, you know, between 7 and 8 or between 6 and 8. I've already mentioned blueberry, rhododendron, azalea. They don't grow well above 7. Other sensitive plants are also susceptible in basic soils, not because they're intolerant of the soil, but because basic soils and the soil chemistry tend to bind up other nutrients, other molecules and things important in plants. Iron, for example, gets bound up in more alkaline, heavy clay soils. pH is above 7.5. So then you end up with iron chlorosis, which is the yellowing of leaves where you still have green veins. When you have certain plants become very susceptible to iron chlorosis because of that iron deficiency, when it's not necessarily a deficiency, it's a problem with soil chemistry binding the iron so it's not usable to the plant. Organic matter, these are just some definitions to give everybody kind of just a nice base to go off of here. Organic matter is essential to the formation of the soil structure, which we're going to talk about. We're talking texture a little bit, and then texture is different than structure. And organic matter helps with compaction, retaining nutrients. Just the more organic matter, the better the soil quality. And in Utah, our native soils, the organic matter is quite low. It's actually about less than 1% by weight if you average the state in the soil. So in some places of the state, we're going to have better. If you go to the mountains, you'll notice the soil is different. It's darker, and in areas where it's been very wooded, lots of decaying material over time. Of course, those soils have a much higher percentage of organic matter than if you're driving out into the West Desert, or you're driving to certain places and it's gray, it's hard. You know, there's not much plant life out there, so of course there's not much organic matter building over time into those soils. All right, so organic matter, it's anything you can add that's has been alive, grown. You know, peat moss, compost, organic amendments, table scraps, all these things that we're going to talk about. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the particles. You got your soil particle is one piece by itself. It's an inorganic, it's rock material essentially, but a different size, all the way down to tiny little rock materials, which are clays. An aggregate is this combination of soil particles stuck together with organic matter, with other molecules of material that's in the ground, fertilizers, nutrients, and then you end up with airspace between these aggregates. So aggregates are really important because it's groupings of these particles that then create passageways not only between the particle, but between the aggregated grouping of particles that allows passage for air, passage for water. So good, healthy soil has good aggregate structure. It's not all just a bunch of single particles that are separate from each other. And so sometimes too much, you'll see soils that turned into almost just this really fine dust. Clays will do that when the aggregates have been broken apart. And then you just end up with a bunch of tiny individual soil particles and they're very, very fine. Makes a giant mess, and they don't do well. It's not good to grow in. It's not good for, you know, a lot of stuff. The soils need to be built back up. All right, so before I get too far into here, there's a few examples of soil structures too: granular, blocky, single grain, massive, platy, just different how soil structures are put together. Now, before I get too far in, I want to put this out there because some of you are gonna, we're all in this thing of, you know, you go out with your shovel and you start digging around and you feel it and you look at it and you're like, oh, I still don't know what I have, you know. How do you know? Well, there's a couple of different ways to know. One is you can actually do a soil test from Utah State University. If you go to your extension office, whatever your county you're in, call them, or you'd actually just need to go in. You pick up a kit, you're gonna pay for it. It could be all the way up to $35. Now it used to be 25. And before that it used to be 10. You know, it's slowly increasing, but you can go get a soil sample kit. They'll sell you that. You'll put the sample in, they'll have instructions of how to sample the soil. You put it in, it gets sent off to the soil lab, and then they send you back this nice soil report that'll give you the pH, the salinity content, macronutrients, micronutrients, percent sand, silt, and clay, all those things that you're going to want to know. And generally they'll provide some recommendations as well on how, what are the amendments? What does this need? Does this soil need a little bit of nitrogen? Does it need potassium? Does it need, you know, calcium? Any of those kind of things. All right. So let's talk about a do-it-yourself test. Now this isn't going to be ultra scientific, but it's going to cover some basics to give you at least a fair idea. So generally speaking, you're going to put a sample into a quart jar. You can put some water in there. Doesn't matter how much water, because you're going to be just measuring the soil layers. Put some soil in there. You don't fill it all the way up, but just put some soil in there, maybe a third full. And you're going to be measuring the layer height and adding up each layer to get the total height equals different percentages of the total soil. So notice in these just little illustrations, the different layering, where you might have loam is equal percentages of sand, silt, and clay, generally. A clay soil has a lot more clay content on top, less sand on the bottom. Notice the thickness of those layers. And I'm going to show you some pictures here. And right after this little soil diagram, we're going to show some pictures. So if you've seen this little soil pyramid before, basically it works just like a regular bar graph. You know, you go up one side and down the other, but there's three and they make a triangle. So by percentage, if you have 50% silt, look at the silt side, 50% sand on the bottom, and then 50% clay on the left, and you were to draw a line straight across to those, you would end up right at just above, you'd end up with a little triangle right above clay loam. If you had an equal 50-50-50 of all of those. If you only had 50% silt and then 40% sand and 20% clay, you end up right in the loam area, you know, or 40% silt and 20% and 40%. So you can kind of see how that works. So knowing the perfect balance, and some of this you can't control. Sometimes the soil is what it is, and you have what you have. I'm just trying to give you a basic understanding. By bringing in truckloads of sand or truckloads of clay to try to mix in, that is not a solution to try to get a good soil, okay? Don't think you're gonna go buy a soil that's gonna fix your existing soil. We're gonna help you do that through composting. So looking then at the real life pictures of this, here's a jar. You simply put that in there, you shake it all up, and you let those layers settle out. So you really mix that soil into that water. You want just a really good slurry of soil mixed with that water, and then you let it sit overnight. And then you'll see heavier particles are sand, they'll settle first, then silts, then clay, then organic matter will float. It'll be at the top. So then you can measure each layer. Measure, in this particular thing, it looks like they're at about 1.5 inches of sand, maybe another 1/2 inch of silt, and then a tiny layer of clay. And so then they can figure out, they're only at 6% clay in this particular case. And so mostly more of a sandy soil. And if there's quite a bit of organic matter, that would be great. But usually, like I said, in our soils, you're not going to have a lot of organic matter there. Here's another one for silt. Here was the clay. Here's one for silt, just showing the percentage of silt, same picture. And then here's the sand. So it's about 70% sand. It was about 24% silt, and about 6% clay. Simply just doing the math. The layer height, total layer height divided by the total height gives you a percent. So in this case, 0.125 divided by 2.125 gives you 6%. Okay, so you can reference this again. It doesn't have to be that hard. It's not scientific. It's just really, you can even just make observations and kind of say, oh, I have 1/3 and 1/3 and 1/3. I have 1/4 and 1/2 and another 1/4. You can kind of just make estimations. You don't have to know exact percentage to know what's going on. You get a general feel for your soil. All right. So in this case, notice the red dot on this diagram puts 6% clay, 24% silt, and 70% sand. And it puts it clear down here into a sandy loam. So not terrible. It's just a loose, loamy soil. Ideally, you're kind of in the loam area. Anywhere in the loam areas are better than being in straight clay, straight silt, straight sand. But the closer to the center you would get, of course, the better the soil texture, and then the better the soil structure is going to be as you continue to work to improve these soils. All right, so far, doesn't look like we have any questions. We'll just continue on. Water then, just a little bit about water before we jump into some of the other elements of soils related to composting and how you're going to compost and what that's going to do to improve soils and how all this works together. So watering soils, if you understand the soil texture of a sand or silt or clay, you're going to understand then how water can potentially move through those spaces around aggregates of soil and around particles of soil. So you have a larger pore spaces in a sandier soil, meaning bigger pore spaces. Water's going to be able to move through them more easily. So notice in the diagram, because water can move through them easily, there's no reason that water, even though it has adhesion properties, the molecules of water tend to want to adhere and stick to other molecules. But because the pores are so large in these sandy soils, water will tend to just move down. It moves down very quickly. Notice the time frame there. In a 24-hour period, now this isn't completely scientific. There's some other things in here. But if you had just a straight profile of that type of soil, in 24 hours, you would move water to a depth of 72 inches. If you just had water starting at the top, it would go all the way that deep. But generally, we don't have layers necessarily that thick in this area either. Some people do. Some of you know you're built on a sand dune and you could just pour water on it. You'd never see it surface again, and water could just keep running straight into the soil forever. For clay, like clay-y soils, as listed here, the pore spaces are small, so you end up with the capillary or that adhesion property of water that tends to cause water to stick to the clay molecules a little bit better, the clay particles. And so water will move slowly, and it also moves horizontally. It starts to move outward from the source because clay is actually layers, stacked little layers on top of each other. I'm going to show you a slide here that shows kind of a little better picture of that. So it causes water to move a little bit more horizontally as well as down, but the down is much slower. So in the course of that same depth, it's going to double the time. And you can even test some of this in your own yard of dig a little hole, fill it full of water, and watch it. If it drains really fast, you've got a looser, sandier, structured soil. If it takes a while, where you come back and an hour later, there's still a puddle there, there's still pooled water, and then 2 hours later, there's still a pool of water, well, you have more clay-like soils that's taking time for that water to move through those tiny little pores and those spaces between aggregates and soil particles. I keep saying molecules, particles, and you're getting that water slowly moving. Now, the opposite's going to happen though when water's evaporating and moving back up. It's water can quickly move out of soils the same way. So sandy soils, water will move quickly in. It also evaporates quickly out. Clay soils takes a long time to get in, takes also more time to evaporate out. So we'll tie the plants into that as well. So ideal soil, you've got portions of air, portions of water, and mineral. Mineral is then the sand, silts, or clays, and then you have this other piece of organic matter. Now, funny enough, look at that percentage right there of organic matter is 5%, and that makes ideal. You don't need to have straight compost. You don't need to grow in 100% organic matter. You still need that mineral content. You still need pore space with water and air. Now, granted, in organic matter, there's a lot of pore space as well, but the mineral content is still important. Now, if you've done raised square foot gardening and some of that, there's no mineral content there. It's actually artificial. It's all artificial soil. It's peat moss, vermiculite, and compost. So you can grow in straight high percentage of organic matter, but you don't need to. And you can't expect to change your entire yard into that. Changing a raised bed into that's one thing. Trying to amend your soils to a really, really high organic content doesn't work. It's not really feasible here in our climate. So here we go with a little bit more soil moisture stuff. You've got just a few terms to understand. When a soil is saturated, it means the pore spaces are full and it can't hold any more water. It's saturated, water will move, it has to move somewhere. So it's either gonna run off the surface, it's gonna continue to drain. If there's nothing below it, it'll continue to drain because I keep saying particles and molecules. The space between those soil particles is full and it can't take on any more water. So all the airspace got filled up with water. Field capacity means it's drained. No more water's coming in. It drained out some, but the particles that are there and the adhesive properties of water are sticking. So there's enough water held in that reservoir that's called field capacity. It means now whatever's there is going to be usable to plants, or it's going to start evaporating, but no more is draining away or running off the surface or anything else. So field capacity is pretty much after an irrigation event, you might reach saturation, but then you'll quickly reach field capacity after everything kind of drains off initially. And then what you'll have is a typical condition is where there's quite a bit more air, a little bit more air. It's just a little bit below field capacity. And it's as water's being used, as roots are taking that up and evaporation's happening. And then you reach a wilting point. A wilting point means there's still a little bit of water. If you dig around in the soil, it'll feel a little bit moist, but there's not enough water to be able to be pulled out. It can't be pulled out of those spaces. It's still adhering a little bit. Water molecules are still there, but plants no longer can take any of that water out. So at wilting point, that's where we got to refill this. We got to put more water into the soil if plants are going to be able to take any. You don't want to necessarily reach wilting point. And then there's one more step that's not on here. Permanent wilting point means we didn't refill the root zone fast enough and a plant got desiccated enough to where now it's a permanent wilt, meaning death, right? You don't want to reach permanent wilting point for any of your plants. All right, so let's move on. So what is topsoil? Topsoil is what you buy in our climate. Topsoil is what you buy that just got screened off another construction site and you paid a lot of money for it. I am joking, but topsoil should be divided. It should be the top. It's the layer. Topsoil is the layer on top that actually is the best soil. It has higher percent organic matter. It's been structurally developing over time. But let's talk about these layers real quick. So the surface layer is horizon A. You have E, B, and C horizons, which are subsoil layers, and then topsoil is essentially the A horizon, characterized by a darker color, higher organic matter, I should have thrown a picture in here. I apologize. To see the soil horizons, if you get into soil science, it's all based on these horizons, these layers of soil. Now, unfortunately, I mean, in our climate, topsoil is not the best anyway, because we have a lack of organic matter. But then because of construction and a lot of stuff, there are times where you might think you're buying topsoil when you've actually ended up going into a B or an E horizon underneath the topsoil, underneath that first layer, because of construction, and then they dig it up and it gets mixed up and then, you know, screened somewhere, but they sell it, but it's really not a true topsoil. But in our climate, it gets sold as such. All right, so let's talk about the benefits of adding compost then. It increases tilt. Now, when we talk about soil tilt, it's just the ease of tilling. Some of you have tilled up your soils, you have heavier clay, it's bumpy, it's hard, it's either too slimy and too muddy and wet, or it makes big old dirt clods, these clumps. Tilth is when you have a really nice soil. It tills easily, it has a nice texture and nice structure because of the organic matter and the balance of sand, silt, and clay. Compost adds fertility. Compost adds water holding capacity. So if no matter what kind of soil, it helps drainage, it helps holding capacity, it helps with aeration. Again, you need air in the soil. If you have a heavy soil and it's full of water, there's no air movement in there. Well, believe it or not, plant roots, they need oxygen. It's funny because the plant tops, they need carbon dioxide, but the plant roots, they need oxygen. They need aeration, they need air movement in that soil. So if there's no air and it's just full of water, your plant will essentially drown. It'll suffocate. There's no air there and you'll kill plants because there's no air. So soils play a really important part of making sure that that aeration is there. And drainage, same thing. So all of the benefits of compost, the benefits in improving a soil structure have all of these benefits. And then it just makes it easier to work, makes it easier to be doing things in your yard. All right, so as far as soil, like I said, we're not getting into soil chemistry, and this class isn't going to last for 2 hours. So as far as the basics of soil, do we have any questions about that before I start into now the process of composting, and then how composting and how do you get that in your soils and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to kind of shift gears here into the composting part of this. So if there's any questions about soils, post those now. Otherwise, I'm moving on. So let's talk about then what happens during composting. Now, this isn't a magical formula. Composting is happening in nature, but in nature, it's happening slowly because no one's out there turning anything, no one's out there mixing anything. You just have organic material, leaves, stems, grass, any organic matter is being dumped to the ground. And then over time, it's just slowly being decomposed. There's bugs, there's things, they rain on it. It slowly breaks down and it slowly adds to the soil. When you compost, you're mimicking that breakdown process, but what you're doing is you're trying to accelerate it. You're mixing, you're doing things that you're going to create this nice, fertile, broken down material that's now usable in your soil, doing it quicker than nature will do it alone. All right. Composting needs microorganisms, it needs oxygen. There's a breakdown process. Breakdown does not happen without microorganisms, without fungus even, the fungi, bacteria. When we talk about bacteria, microorganisms, it's bacteria. So don't get all, I hope nobody gets all grossed out and think, oh no, bacteria, what? Bacteria make you sick. No, most bacteria don't make you sick. I shouldn't say most. There's a lot of beneficial bacteria, and we need these bacteria to help in this process of breaking down our organic matter to turn it into something usable that plants can use and improve soil. All right, composting then, these microorganisms, just by their process, they're generating heat. And then it's the heat that's going to help speed the breakdown process. So it's a fine balance of trying to get the right amount of heat, the right amount of organic material, and then greens and browns, and I'll talk about this in again a little bit more. But then the result is also carbon dioxide. It's just like breathing. We breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. This is a metabolic process. What's happening with microorganisms as they help generate, well, they're using their metabolism, eating material, breaking stuff apart, generating heat, just like your body generates heat, and the byproduct is carbon dioxide. Half of the weight of the pile, if you're doing a compost pile and you start out with a 2-foot tall pile, you're going to end up with only 1 foot of compost because half of that pile gets lost. It's broken down. It's now turned into something different. Some carbon dioxide gets left off, water vapor gets off, and you're going to be about total weight of about half of what you start with. So, all right, moving on to the steps for a successful compost pile or successful composting. There's a few different methods here. Now, if you do not want to, I imagine most of you are taking this class because you want to compost yourself. Once we go through this, if you decide, maybe I don't want to compost myself, you can buy compost. The landfill is doing the same process on a massive scale. They're taking all the green waste. People are dumping their trees there, their branches, you know, anything, and they're simply grinding it all up to make it smaller, to speed this composition, this decomposition, I should say. They grind it all up and they're piling it. There's stuff added. I shouldn't say stuff. There's water added. They're actually trying to create an environment for bacteria to grow that can start this process, and then they turn it. They have machines that'll just turn these massive piles of this shredded wood material and grass clippings and all this, and they're turning it and it's heating. Occasionally in the winter, you can drive by a landfill and you just see it steaming. It's putting off all kinds of heat. But these are the steps. Okay, you may do this in your yard, or you may just opt to go buy compost somewhere. Either way is going to work. So number one is just select the site. You got to decide where can you effectively do this in your yard. Now, sometimes you don't have to have a massive location, but if you're not doing composting right, it can get stinky. If you're doing it right, you'll get some odor, but it shouldn't be a massive stink that, you know, causes an evacuation through your neighborhood. You know, like, oh no, who died? What's going on? It shouldn't be like that. So if you're doing it right, it may give some odor, but it won't be really stinky. But too many times, I think people don't do it right, or you don't pay attention, and it starts to stink before you realize it. It should be in a location to get some sunlight. Don't just put this in a dark corner somewhere. The sun, these microorganisms, they're going to need some light. It's important to help, you know, heat. Just sunlight's important. 6 hours of light should be a goal or more. You should have a water source nearby, because you don't want the compost pile to dry out. The drier it is, you don't want it soggy either. It's a balance. You don't want just a really dry pile. You don't want a big soggy mess either. So it goes back to a balance, but it's going to need some water to feed the organisms. They need water source. And then it should be an area with good drainage. In addition to having the water, again, you don't want it soggy. You just don't want this giant mess. All right, now let's talk about the container. Consider, if you're buying some sort of composting container, consider the price, the size, the convenience. There's all kinds, and I've got a few pictures in here that I'll show you in just a second. You can buy the tumblers and bins and stuff. Just kind of consider, how much composting can you do feasibly? How much time can you put into it? And how much do you really want to spend for this? You don't need a fancy container, but some of those containers that they have a crank, you can turn them, and, you know, makes it easy, but you don't necessarily need it, but it could help you, could facilitate it. They should allow airflow, and they should resist decay, which is why some of these new ones, they're made out of plastics, these polymer materials. And if you want to build something out of wood, just realize your wood thing is also going to be breaking down, and over time you'll have to maybe replace it. If you build some bin out of wood, those wood things will break down as well. But you can always compost without a container. So here's a few examples, and then, like I said, I'm going to show you some pictures. One's just called a heap. You just simply have a compost pile. You heap it all up. Doesn't have any container, doesn't have any edges. You just create a location and you start piling. It's great for what's called a no-turn composting, but it takes longer. So you're layering materials in there. You dump some leaves, and then you dump grass clippings, and then more leaves, and you add newspaper, and it just builds up a pile, and then it's kind of just sits. Essentially, kind of cover it up, and it just sits and it takes a long time, but it breaks all down. This is where if you're not balanced just right, you could end up with a little bit of stink, just depending on what those layers are and the right composition. This is kind of a compost heap, these pictures here. They're not turned, there's a lot of stuff in there, and it is going to break down. It just may take a little more time without the turning. But what's in the middle, it'll probably get hot in there. You know, depending, you want to be careful. I'm going to talk about the materials you add in there to not attract rodents and animals and that kind of stuff. But a compost heap works. If you have a space for it, you want just to pile somewhere in the corner, you just start piling, go for it. There's a hoop method. Use a wire mesh, lower cost. It's tidier than a heap, made of kind of this woven wire fencing. Here's a picture of that. Again, notice the layering. We're going to talk about the layering of how you do this to be probably the most effective and quick about this. So there's the hoop method. You could do the wire in a uncircular pattern, a non-circular pattern if you wish, but this makes it nice and tidy. Now notice when you want to get to that, you're thinking, how do I get to that? Well, usually you can just unwrap that roll. It's tied together on one end. You just unwrap it and take the wire off, and now there's your pile, and then you can turn it or shovel it or move it. So it's a pretty easy way. Again, not a lot of turning here because it's kind of hard to access into the bottom to stir this pile, but you could leave the material in there for a while, take off the wire, turn it all around, redo the wire, and then throw it all back in to continue it composting. A box or a bin could be made out of wood, could be made out of cinder block, could be made out of whatever materials. They look good. They could be low to moderate cost, but leave some space. Leave some space between the sides of your box for airflow. But in this case, notice the pallets. There's airflow in those pallets because all the boards aren't just tight together. But in a case like with the cinder blocks or something where there's no air movement, you want to leave some space. Don't just cram everything up against the edges because it won't get a lot of air movement along those outside edges, just along their surface where air is flowing well. But these could look good, easily turned, I suppose. You get your pitchfork in there, you stab it, you move it around, you can stir these a bit, move them around. Barrel methods, you could make these homemade if you found an old barrel. They're moderate to high cost depending if you buy some pretty fancy ones with the cranks. They are tidy, they don't take up a lot of space. Quick composting because you can crank them, turn them, they can get quite warm. And you actually get the extra heating of the sun. It's contained in a container like that. Speeds that process up. So if you don't have a lot and you want quick compost, this is one method to do that. Here's some examples of those kind of bins. Notice the blue one on the bottom. It's kind of a homemade thing, an old water barrel, or Coca-Cola. They actually have their syrups in those big barrels. You can buy those. They usually smell like whatever came in them. If you like Dr. Pepper or Coke, you might like that. But you can make your own like this. You can buy them, different kinds of tumbling methods, stirs up the stuff. Works really well, actually. A little bit tidier, like I said, easy to load, easy to unload. You can dump that stuff out into a wheelbarrow and onto the ground, shovel it, whatever you want to do there. There's a couple other small ones. There's lots of different composting methods out there. Not one won't necessarily be better than another. Just it's personal preference, when you come to this kind of stuff. How much space you have, how much compost you have. If you're generating lots of table scraps and lots of grass clippings every week, maybe these little ones aren't adequate. Maybe you need a better method. But if you just have a little bit of stuff, well, this is one way to compost that and turn it into something beneficial for your soil. And then I'll add this last one here before we move on to some other stuff. Trench composting. This is different. I throw this in at the very end because it does not involve bins. It doesn't involve turning. It simply involves you're digging trenches and then you're adding your organic material into that trench and you're burying it. And just over the course of a growing season, it's not a lot. It's not a real thick layer. And if it gets some moisture, you wouldn't want to do this in just completely dry soils. But if it gets some moisture through the year, the microbes in the soil, they're going to be breaking down that material. So after one full season, usually if you went to till that, cultivating there, you wouldn't see any of that stuff left. It would all be broken down. Now it's already in your soil. And to be honest, this is how I compost in my own garden. I don't have time for a pile. I don't want to deal with a pile. I just don't want to mess with it. So I just dig trenches in between my rows. I have a pretty traditional garden. It's in the ground. I have rows of stuff. I've got drip tubing, drip tape along those rows, but I can easily dig a little bit. I just actually use a skinny shovel too, and I can just dig a small trench, a couple feet long at a time. And as I have table scraps, as I have stuff, I just go dump them out there and bury it. And then I keep digging that trench until then I move to a different location and dig that trench. And then every year when I cultivate, every spring or every fall, whenever I get to it, then I till that all in. And to me, that adds the material. I feel like I'm composting, I'm adding the organics, but I'm not dealing with a pile. And this one works for me. It may not work for everybody, but I like this method. So let's move then to now selecting the raw materials. This is going to be the important part as we start to get into the kind of that balance and maybe the chemistry, not full chemistry. This is not going to be the chemistry lesson, but kind of how composting is going to work. So you're selecting your raw materials. Almost all natural organic material will compost. So pine needles will compost. Newspaper will compost. These are organics. These are tree products, right? These are things that once were growing. That's what we refer to natural and organic. They were once growing, they were once alive, and they can be composted. But we're going to talk about a few things that were once alive that should not be composted in your compost pile. And there's some reasons. Okay, but compost does require the heat and the right balance of those nutrients and ingredients, which I'm going to go over. All right, so let's take a little quiz. This is quiz time. This is what's going to go in your pile. All right, yes or no, you're going to answer on your own. What goes in your pile? Weeds. I'll give you 2 seconds, 1, 2, to think about it. Do weeds go in your pile? The answer is yes, weeds can go in your pile. And you're thinking, no, you're crazy. You're a crazy person. Weeds can go in your pile because if you're composting correctly, now let me step one step back. I wouldn't put weeds in my trench compost because it's not really heating up like a real compost. There's decomposition happening, but it's not getting hot enough to sterilize the weed seeds. But in a true compost pile, weeds can certainly go in there because it's actually going to get hot enough to kill those weed seeds. It's going to make those seeds inviable if you're truly composting correctly. If you're not composting correctly and you have a bunch of weeds in there, those weeds may make it through that process. And then, yeah, you've just spread the weed seeds back into your soil. But if done correctly, weeds can absolutely go in. Paper, can paper go in? Answer is yes and no. And you're like, what? Okay, yes, newspaper can go in, but you would want to avoid the color glossy paper. Just use plain old newsprint or cardboard even. But not glossy cardboard. You can tell the film on them, they're glossy, they're shiny, they're slick. If it has that glossy feel to it, don't use that kind of paper or cardboard. But if it's just plain old newsprint, black and white, just plain old corrugated cardboard, those materials are essentially tree materials. It's like putting small branches of broken up material, back into the ground. It can be composted. All right, grass clippings. Yes, of course, grass clippings are great for compost, both brown and green. We'll talk about that in a second. Cow manure, I showed a picture of cow manure, but in general, any manure we'll talk about. Yes or no. The answer, of course, yes, manure can absolutely be used. Now, you would maybe want to choose which manures. I've known guys that will compost horse manure, works great. Cow manure works great. Chicken manure or turkey works great, fantastic, high nutrients. I don't know anybody that uses pig manure, and there's reasons for that. And human manure, human waste, no, you don't add that to your compost pile. But animals that are usually eating grass, like horses, cows, chickens and turkeys are a little bit unique, but they're great because of the ammonia levels and different things. Anyway, those are the 4 that I'd probably say yes: horses, cows, turkeys, and chickens. Maybe if you have llamas or if you raise those kind of animals, you could use that for compost. Rabbits, you could use that as well. All right, dog and cat poo. No, absolutely not. Don't use that. in your compost. You know, it's a manure, right? It's waste. No, don't use it. They're eating other things. They're eating meat products. They're eating different things. Don't use those in your compost pile. It's not going to be good. It creates different, there's a different bacteria, different things going on. Don't use them. Dairy products, leftover, you know, your yucky sour cream, your something that went moldy in the fridge, your cheese. No, don't throw those in there either. No dairy products go in the compost pile. These are the kind of things that they're oily, they're different greasy. They'll start to attract animals. They're going to stink differently and rot differently, and they're going to attract the undesirables to your compost pile. Meat, again, no. Do not add meat to your compost pile in any form or fashion. Fat scraps, or, you know, whatever, you had a barbecue grill and you had leftover a couple whatever scraps, and no, don't, just throw those away. Don't throw them in your compost. Again, you want to avoid attracting rodents, raccoons, whatever, that will smell this, and they're going to come digging through your compost to try to find it. Finding enough eggshells. Here we go. Yes or no? Yes, you may use eggshells. Eggshells will break down just fine. They actually have the shell, you know, high in calcium. There's some different things there. Weird enough, you kind of think, well, eggs and meat, and eggshells dry out pretty quick. They're not going to stink and rot and do the same things you would have as meat byproducts in a compost pile. So eggshells are fine. Plastics, of course, no. You're not going to use any of those. And then coffee grounds. Yes, you may absolutely use coffee grounds. Great in a compost pile. Great to help improve soil. Tea bags. Yes and no. And this is a trick question. The material in the bag is fine, not the bag itself. Okay, so if you were going to cut that open and shake out the, you know, after you've made your tea or whatever, you cut those open and throw the little bag away. Yes, but don't just throw the bags out there. They're not really going to break down the material in them. You just need to empty those before you, and then empty the material into the compost is fine, not the bag itself. And then wood. Can you throw wood and sticks and debris? Absolutely. One thing to note here, however, is that the size of the wood is going to dictate the rate of the decomposition. So if you're throwing giant logs in there, just expect that to take some time to break that down. So the smaller the pieces, the quicker the breakdown will be. Which is why, you know, in the large compost production locations, they're shredding everything up into fine pieces first, because the finer the pieces, the quicker the breakdown with those pieces. Citrus and fruit, technically, yes. There's not really any issues with those. You can add them. You may read different things. Some will say yes, some will say no. They're fine. They're going to break down. So technically, yes, they will work. All right, so moving on to the additional materials. You want to think of carbon-rich and nitrogen-rich materials. So all plant-based products have some of this in it. They'll have carbon, they have nitrogen. Greener materials have more nitrogen. Browner materials are going to have more carbon, or kind of a balance. Just because it's green or brown doesn't necessarily dictate one or the other. But getting the right balance, here you'd probably want to think of 2 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And you'll read different things about this. Just doing a Google search, I did one because I was curious if this is the right number. And you'll have some that say, oh, 50-50, 50, you know, half browns, half greens. Now we're talking browns meaning dried up. Carbon dried materials means like dried grass clippings or sticks, pine needles, things that are brown, they're dried up. This is the newspaper, the cardboard. It's dry, it doesn't have a lot of moisture content to it. Whereas the nitrogen rich, they're the greens. Think of greens and browns if you want to in this sense. Greens and browns. Greens are your freshly cut grass clippings. Browns would be grass clippings that have dried out for 3 weeks. And they're the same product, but one now is brown, dry, one's green. It has moisture and it has stuff. So think of when you're creating your compost pile, you want to have about 2 parts brown and 1 part green. And that balance is actually going to help create the right environment for the microorganisms, which helps generate the heat. If you have too much green, it's hard to generate the heat. If you have too much brown, then you don't have enough of the other to feed the microorganisms to generate the heat. So that balance is actually important. You will also read sometimes 3 to 1 or 1 to 1. So here's kind of a happy medium: 2 parts brown, 1 part green, or somewhere close to that, and you'll be right on there. So here's, I always get ahead of my slides when I'm talking. Here's your carbon-rich materials. You can use straw, you can use newspaper, sticks, and brown dry stuff. We already talked about that. Greens, this is actually your manure. This is your grass clippings, your table. I say table scraps, meaning the peels from produce. You peel a potato, there's a little bit of lettuce, the weird ends of the lettuce, the tops of things, the stuff you're not eating off of vegetables, all of that's greens. And all of it can be composted real easily, okay? So how do I know if I've hit the right balance? This is actually the key question for everybody. How do you know? How do you know when you've hit it? Well, too much nitrogen is going to call the carbon is used up before the nitrogen is stabilized, and you'll start to get stink. It'll start to smell, a strong ammonia, foul odors, because the carbon gets used up, and you got this leftover stuff that starts, chemistry happens and it starts changing forms and it starts stinking. Okay, if you have too much carbon, too much dry, there's not enough nitrogen to break down the material, so composting slows. So one thing you can do is if you got a lot of browns, you're not sure on the balance of greens, you can make up the difference by adding a little bit of just fertilizer. Add a little bit of nitrogen-rich fertilizer to feed the microorganisms in your brown pile, and that helps. If you have too much greens, there's no way to fix that other than adding more browns. That's where you add cardboard, add newspaper, add browns in there to try to help bring that balance back together. Okay, now aeration. Aeration is really important because the composting consumes large amounts of oxygen. Those little microbes are in there just eating away, doing their thing. They're using up the oxygen. So if it just sits, it starts to become what we call anaerobic. There's no oxygen there. The microbes that need the oxygen, they're going to move away, try to get to oxygen. Instead of being in the center of the pile, heating it, decomposing, they get out of there. And then the center, because it's anaerobic, there's no oxygen, it actually just starts to rot. It starts to stink. There's other processes happening that are not decomposition, it's just rotting. And that's where you get stink. So not enough oxygen, it slows everything down, not a desirable situation. Therefore, turning the pile, that's why those barrels are good. Any way to increase oxygen into that pile is what you want to do. Turning it frequently enough to keep it aerated so it does not become anaerobic and start stinking. Okay, turning it weekly will produce a finished compost fairly quickly, 1 to 2 months. Now this depends. If you have a huge pile, it may take a little longer than that, but on a kind of an average home scale, you can, if you're composting correctly, you've got the right balances, everything, in 1 to 2 months of turning that regularly, you could actually have a finished compost that's nice, it smells earthy, loamy, ready to go right into your garden or in your beds. If monthly turning, if you do this less regular, it'll take you half a year, 4 to 6 months. So the more frequently you turn, the more quickly composting is happening. The decomposition of these materials is happening. If you just set a pile there and leave it, well, it may take you a year to 2 years for that thing to break down. And then the edges still won't be broken down because they're not heating. The microorganisms are not in there, doing their thing. So the center might be great after a couple of years, nice and composted, broken down, but it's going to be slower because the oxygen, the microbes, all the stuff, that balance. So the more you turn, the faster it goes. There, no turning, 6 to 12 months, depending again on the pile. So it looks like I have a question. Can I continually add to the pile? The answer is yes, you can. Understanding though that if you're continuously adding and wanting to take out, you may get pieces of that compost that aren't fully composted. They may be partially broken down, and that's fine. Even in compost that you buy, you'll still see some larger pieces occasionally because that's what they've done. They've probably added in, things did not get fully done. That's fine. Little pieces can continue to break down over time in your bed or in your garden. The challenge would be if you're continuously adding so much and not giving it enough time. So you may want to have a pile that's a little bit elongated. So maybe you're adding on one end and stirring it all together, but it's being added on one end, and your pile maybe slowly moves somehow. It's back and forth through a little area. So you're adding, but this end over here, it's more done. And then as time goes on, I start working on this, and then I start adding to this end again. And so it's kind of maybe a back and forth in a slightly moving pile. That way you give everything a full opportunity to compost or decompose before you actually put it where it needs to be. Because that's a great question. And if you don't, I'll just tell you this, if something's not completely broken down, that's not the end of the world. What will happen though is when you put that compost in the ground or wherever it's going, it'll still need some nutrients to finish the decomposition. So if you put it in your vegetable garden, what will happen is there are microbes in the ground. They'll start working on that unfinished organic matter, and they're going to need a little bit of nitrogen to feed it. So what will happen is they'll take a little nitrogen to finish it, and then more nitrogen will be released. But in the middle of that process, they'll require a little nitrogen. So too much of that actually is stealing a little bit of new nitrogen from the soil initially. So if you planted your garden right away, you may see like what would appear to be a nitrogen deficiency until all of that's broken down, and then the nitrogen's put back. It's there, but it just kind of delays a little bit of that nitrogen availability for plants. I hope that's understandable. So sometimes if you know it's not fully composted, add a little fertilizer with it when you put it into the ground. Add just a little bit of nitrogen. It'll help finish the decomposition without stealing the nitrogen from your plants. And when it's fully broke down, all that extra nitrogen is available to your stuff. All right, so keeping your pile moist. Moisture is an important part of the metabolic process for microorganisms. They've got to have it. You can't expect them to be living in a completely desiccated pile, bone dry, and nothing's gonna survive in that. It's just not gonna work. So microorganisms, they need moisture, which is why as you're stirring, you may be spraying it with just a little bit of water. Not mud, not a saturated, soggy pile of mess, but you're giving it a little bit of moisture. And especially now, if you're composting through the summer months, there's a lot of evaporation happening. Those piles will dry out. So you'll need to, water your compost pile, for lack of a better term. You're gonna have to water it a little, not a lot. Don't just sit and let the sprinklers run on it forever, but give it a little water, keep that process moving. Keep the pile to 40 to 65% moisture range, meaning it's moist but not saturated. It's not even at field capacity. It's great. It's half full of water as far as the particles and things, air spaces, but not. It's moist enough, but not too moist. If you can squeeze water out, it's too wet. So if you pick up a pile and you squeeze it and it's dripping, absolutely too wet. If it feels dry, you're rubbing it. Now, granted, if it's a brand new pile, it's going to be hard to gauge that. But as it starts composting, if you can feel through it and it's like, wow, this feels super dry, well, then give it some water. Add water as needed. Keeping it at the proper temperature. Now, great in the summer, right? Because we're already reaching 102 degrees some days right now. But 110 to 150 degrees for your pile is ideal. Down in the middle of that pile, it should be really warm. If you stick your hand in a compost pile, it should be really warm. That warmth, it's the bacteria, it's working, and that warmth is also killing the harmful stuff. It's killing weed seeds, it's killing bad bacteria, it's doing what it should be doing to make the soil healthy, to make this material, this decomposed material, healthy and ready to go back into your garden. Okay, I already said this. Kills pathogens, weed seeds, fly larvae. If it's too low, then you need to try turning the pile. Turn that pile over. If it still doesn't heat up and the pile has the proper amount of water and air and even the carbon and nitrogen, then your compost is complete. If you notice a drop in the temperature, now granted, you might be sticking a thermometer in it, but if it just feels cool now, you notice it's been warm and warm and warm, and all of a sudden everything is cool, then that's when you're going to know, oh, I'm done. We're done with the breakdown process. We're complete. It's ready to put back into the garden. Okay, you're finished and you've done a great job there. So finished compost should be dark, it should be crumbly, and it should have an earthy smell. Earthy meaning it doesn't stink. It smells like healthy dirt. For lack, I mean, how do you describe that, right? How do you describe earthy smell? You know what I think you know what I mean. It just smells okay. And honestly, fresh dirt, when you freshly till a garden and all, there's just something about that. You can tell it smells good. Good in a weird way. I don't want that to sound really weird. Most piles benefit from additional curing to allow any final chemical or decomposition. So it's not bad if your compost is done and you're not ready for it, just leave it, let it sit, it's fine. It'll just sit there, it'll cure. If it's a little too much of anything, too much nitrogen, too much something, some of that'll leach out a little bit. So don't panic. You don't have to use this right away or put it back into your garden. You can allow the pile to sit for 1 to 2 months, waiting for it to kind of finally cure. So as you're doing this process, sometimes people they compost and then over winter, it's finished and then they're ready in the spring and it's set. It has already set for a couple months, even though the temperatures have been cooler, but by spring, by the time April rolls around, it's like, oh, I'm digging into that compost, I'm adding it into my beds, I'm tilling it into my garden. And that's a great time. It's a great time when you're cultivating the soil, you're cleaning things up, you're adding that compost, putting the plants in your vegetable garden or around your plants in your beds. That's a great time to do that. So with that, we've done a really crash course. I'm just a little over an hour, but we have time for questions. I went through that really fast, but that's the basic crash course of backyard composting and just the really basics of soils to help you understand. Now, mixing that into your soils, some people will put compost directly on their beds, and that's fine. As a top dressing, you can add compost as a decorative. Some people do this. They'll buy compost and they'll spread it over the top and as a mulch, and it looks great, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can definitely use compost as a mulch. As it rains, as you apply water, some of the nutrients of that compost will be leaching in the soil. The ideal benefit of using it as mulch is if in the spring or fall, you can cultivate it in. Every year, you're kind of doing this process new, and you're getting the compost into the ground eventually, because that's what's going to build the soil eventually. If you only leave it as a top dress, never actually mixing it, the soil chemistry, it's benefiting from the mulch on top, with the reduced evaporation and all this stuff, but you're really not building soil structure like you could be. Okay, so I hope that's a little bit understandable. So, but absolutely, you can use it as a top dress. Put it on top, cultivate it into the ground, till it in. For vegetable gardens, there's no better way. I mean, adding that organics, you're building soil structure, water holding capacity, the nutrients in there for vegetables, and it's a great way to go. So I had one question here about trench composting, to talk a little bit more about that. And so let me just quickly run back through my slides just to show you that picture. It'll take just a second to get back through these. Oops, here we go. Back. Oops. All right, so here's an example. I showed you these pictures. So there's really not a lot of technical stuff to trench composting. It's really just simply digging a trench. You're digging that down, 6 to 12 inches. You don't really need to probably go below 12. Somewhere even, you want it deep enough. You don't want anybody digging that up. I shouldn't say anybody, any animals or anything digging it up. So, but you want it fully covered under soil. So you're digging a trench 6 to 8 inches probably, because usually in your beds, you're not tilling below 8. At least I'm not. With my tiller, I'm tilling, 8 inches down. So 6 to 8 inches down, You just dig a trench. It can be narrow, it can be wide, depending on how much material you need in there. And then just as you have the material, now, if you don't generate enough table scraps, the leftover veggies and all that kind of stuff, then you could be adding manure this way. As long as you understand, fresh manure is what's termed hot. It's high in nitrogen, high in ammonia. And if you plant it directly right after applying fresh manure, you'll burn your plants. It's just too much nitrogen, it'll burn them. And they look burnt. They look like they've just been scalded in the sun or something. And so, but you could do trench composting if you understand you're not going to grow right there for at least a whole year. So you could add it in, you bury it, and then that's it. You leave it alone. I actually add, because I know that the microbes in the soil need a little extra nitrogen, depending on the greens. And I don't actually bury a lot of browns, grass clipping sometimes, but most of this is just, it's the watermelon rinds, it's the cantaloupe pills, it's the potato pills, it's your leftover produce stuff from your house that I'm throwing into the trench, and then I just bury it, and then you just leave it alone. I just leave it, and I'm cultivating, I'm tilling up my garden. Like I said, I sometimes till in the fall. I actually like to till in the fall, because if there's bug eggs and stuff, tilling those up in the fall can sometimes just kill them, gets rid of everything. But if I know I've got a trench that I've just recently buried, a lot of times I may till it, or I may not. I may just skip that little section, because I sometimes till again in the spring after winter, snow has settled everything, mashed down, kind of compressed, and I'll till again. You don't necessarily want to over till your soils either, because that can break up soil structure. But tilling twice a year, at least in my experience with my garden, has been fantastic with the soils I have. And so this is just one easy way that I'm not dealing with a pile. There is enough air movement. My soils are not really, really heavy. And so there's air movement. There's water there because I'm watering already on the rows. So I'm doing between rows. So there's a little bit of moisture already in the soil. So by 1 year, I never see evidence of anything I've put in those trenches. It breaks down and it's gone. So I hope that answered that question, just to clarify that a little bit. It's pretty easy, and you don't end up with a pile that you're dealing with, which for me, that's been beneficial. For some, they'd really rather do a pile, and they'd really rather end up with this nice loamy composted material to use around their plants or in special places. For me, it's all going in my garden. It just all goes in my vegetable garden. So this works the best for me. It saves me some time and effort, and just the stage of life I'm in and what I'm doing, this is it. So doesn't mean it works for everybody. Doesn't mean that's just the way to go. A couple more questions. If a compost pile sits over winter, it will still have the nutrients the following spring. Yes, there may be a little bit of nitrogen leach. Nitrogen can leach out of soil, so water can push it through. So if it sits, you may, depending on that winter, depending on the water, it may leach out some of the nitrogen in there that's available, but you'll still have a lot of nutrients. This is just good, fertile material that's going to increase the capacity, I should say the structures of soils, the growing ability, the nutrients of soils. So it's perfectly fine, understanding though that you may lose just a little bit of the nitrogen content, the percent, but it's still fantastic, just works great. Does it help to sprinkle the compost around growing plants? The answer to that is also yes, it does. It serves as a mulch. A mulch is anything on the ground that's going to help reduce evaporative loss and to moderate soil temperature for plants that are growing, the roots in there. Anytime you can moderate the root temperatures, that's great. And then you'll also get some, like I just mentioned, you'll get some leaching of those nutrients into that soil around that plant. So they will benefit some from that compost on top, but some of it also depends on how you're watering. If most of the watering is done at the surface through drip, not a lot of that water is moving through the compost to take some of that nutrient with it. So you'll get maybe a little less. If you're overspraying, you'll get maybe a little more, but we kind of discourage overspraying in beds because you're spraying water in a lot of places you don't need it. But yes, you can certainly benefit from the compost around plants. And then if it's especially in an annual bed or a bed that you're cultivating, as I mentioned, once you're done with that bed in the spring or fall, you're kind of cultivating, you're mixing that compost into the soil. So absolutely it benefits. And then you're putting some new around that plant the next year to make it look good, adding it back into the soil when you're done. So absolutely a good way to use compost. Thank you. We've been burying stuff in the yard. That was helpful. Great. Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate the comments and the questions. I hope this has been beneficial. I hope you've gained something. This is just a really quick, there you could really get into a lot more depth on soil chemistry and just the chemistry of how the microbes are doing their thing and all the stuff. We didn't want to go there. We just wanted to try to keep this as simple as we could, to just help you understand you can do this. If you really want to compost and you've got materials, do it. There's no reason to throw this stuff in a landfill. You can be just creating nice, healthy, fertile stuff in your own yard. The balance though is you just don't want to attract rodents. You don't want to attract raccoons. So please just balance things so that you get a compost and not a stink. Don't offend your neighbors with this stinky pile that's next to where they like to sit on their porch or something like that, right? But appreciate you joining us. Really quick again, I know you're still here. This has been recorded. I'll post the slides. I'll post the video tomorrow. And so if you want to reference this again, if you have further questions, you can always email myself. I should have posted my email in my name here. No, it'll take me too long to do that. It's drice@weberbasin.com, or Hattie Ann, you could email her, Fassold, so HFASSOLD @weberbasin.com. You can email either one of us. We'd be happy to answer your questions. I also should mention really quick, while some of you are still there, this will be our last online class. We're going to shift and start going back to some in-person classes. However, if you can't make an in-person class, we'll record them. It's just that they won't be live to be doing an in-person, trying to engage with people in the classroom and trying to engage with people remotely. So we're going to be doing some in-person classes in August coming up, starting on the 4th, with a native plant class. We'll do another irrigation workshop. We'll do one on cactus and succulents, some things in August, and then into September. So if you can't join us, we'll record them. They'll be able to be viewed later, which we would encourage, but we'd love for you to come, be engaged with you here at our site with our garden. But just kind of to give you that heads up, if you're not seeing much on online classes coming forward, we're kind of shifting a little bit. We're going to see how things go on. We'll probably offer some online. We'll probably offer some in person as we go forward next year, because some of these are great. We appreciate the audience, and we know it facilitates travel. It facilitates a lot, but we also love to have people here on site. They can see our garden. We can engage with you in a class. So keep that in mind, I guess, coming up as you look at the classes in the future in August. So for now, that kind of wraps up. This wraps up July. This is our only class in July. There's just a lot of vacations, holidays. There's things going on, but this is a great time to be thinking about your garden, your soils. So appreciate you joining us. If there's no more questions, I'll just wait another minute, and then we'll just wrap it up from here. And please come to the garden though. If you're out and about and you want to stop by and just walk around the garden, it is open 8 to 8 every day. So we'd encourage that. One person said they missed the very beginning. The video will be posted on our website, weberbasin.com, under the classes and events section. You can just look for the title, Soils and Composting. There's 2 sections. One for, you'll have to click here. It says click here for slides. And then the other one is click here for video. So if depending on which one you want, you'll click in a little different place and it'll link you over to those resources. The garden is located in Layton, 2837 East, Highway 193. Highway 193 is the east-west highway that's just south of Hill Air Force Base. And so we're clear on the east side. If you're heading east, on the west side of Hill Air Force Base, you're heading east, we're clear up almost to 89. If you're coming from north or south, you can go on 89, and we're just almost the first thing as you start heading west on Highway 193. So we'd be glad to welcome anybody here. It's open to the public, it's free, 8 to 8 every day. So we appreciate you joining us again. Hope it was useful, and happy gardening, happy composting, you know, improving your soils. We definitely need to improve soils here. No matter what you have currently, organic matter and compost will improve it. And so with that, you know, whatever you can do to add organics, leaves, if you're getting leaves, and compost those leaves, add those in and till them in. Any organic matter in a soil is going to improve it no matter what you have. So with that, I think that's all our questions. I appreciate it again. Have a good night, everybody, and we'll see you next time.